The silence in Appalachian Station 47 began at 3:17 a.m. on October 15th, when Ranger Thomas Millfield's final radio transmission cut to static mid-sentence, his voice trailing off as he whispered, "They're not supposed to be here." What the rescue teams found 3 days later defied every natural law they knew. Millfield's boots, still tied and positioned as if he'd simply stepped out of them, sitting on a cliff face 800 feet above the valley floor, with no rope, no ladder, no possible way a human being could have climbed there. But it was the contents of his final logbook entry that turned their blood to ice water. Detailed descriptions of 12 separate missing persons cases spanning 60 years, people he'd never heard of, disappearances that hadn't happened yet, written in his own handwriting but dated 3 months into the future. The Appalachian Mountains stretch across 13 states, their ancient peaks shrouded in morning mist and afternoon shadows that seem to move independent of the sun, and somewhere in those 205,000 square miles of untamed wilderness, something is methodically erasing human beings from existence, leaving behind only questions that grow more terrifying with each answer. Tonight, we descend into the heart of America's most haunted mountain range, where missing doesn't mean lost, where disappeared doesn't mean dead, and where the only thing more frightening than vanishing without a trace is discovering exactly what's been taking people for generations, and realizing it's not finished yet. Case 1. The Cartographer's Final Map. Ethan Caldwell had built his reputation on mapping the impossible, charting territories where other surveyors feared to tread, from the maze-like slot canyons of Utah where shadows fell at angles that defied the sun's position to the windswept coastal regions of Alaska where magnetic anomalies turned compasses into spinning toys. His portfolio contained surveys of places that existed in legal limbo, geographical dead zones that somehow escaped decades of satellite imaging and federal mapping initiatives, but when the Kentucky Geological Survey contacted him in late August with their most unusual commission yet, even Caldwell felt a flutter of unease. They needed someone to chart a section of Daniel Boone National Forest that had become what they termed cartographically problematic, an area roughly 12 square miles where multiple surveying attempts had failed, where satellite imagery showed different topographical features depending on the season it was captured, and where even experienced local hunters admitted to becoming hopelessly disoriented within minutes of entering what they called the fold. The historical records surrounding this particular section of forest read like a catalog of bureaucratic nightmares spanning over a century. The original territorial survey from 1887 listed coordinates that placed portions of the area in 4 different states simultaneously, while subsequent attempts to resolve the boundary disputes only deepened the mystery. A 1923 geological expedition returned with topographical maps that showed underground cave systems extending to depths that would place them below sea level, despite the region's elevation of nearly 2,000 feet above sea level. Military surveys conducted in the 1940s during wartime mineral assessments were classified and sealed, though declassified fragments spoke of unusual magnetic phenomena and spatial discontinuities requiring further study. Most recently, a team from the United States Geological Survey had spent 6 weeks in the area during 2019, returning with sophisticated digital mapping data that showed the landscape changing configuration on a daily basis, as if the very bedrock was shifting and reforming when no one was watching. Dr. Janet Morrison, the lead geologist who hired Caldwell, met him at the Forest Service station in Pine Ridge on a gray September morning that carried the smell of approaching autumn and something else. A metallic tang in the air that seemed to make compasses quiver and cell phone signals fade to static. She spread out a collection of maps across the conference table, each one purporting to show the same geographical area but displaying wildly different features. "We've had 17 different mapping attempts over the past decade," she explained, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent too many sleepless nights trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Ground-penetrating radar shows cave systems that don't appear in physical exploration. Satellite thermal imaging detects temperature variations that suggest underground rivers flowing uphill. GPS coordinates taken at the same physical location vary by as much as 3 miles depending on the time of day they're recorded. She pointed to a particular section of forest that appeared as a blank space on several maps. The locals have stories about this place going back generations. Hunters who entered following fresh deer tracks and emerged 3 days later at the spot they started, swearing they'd walked in straight lines the entire time. Hikers whose GPS units show them traveling at impossible speeds, covering distances that would require them to be moving at 60 miles per hour through dense forest. Caldwell studied the conflicting surveys with the analytical mind that had made him legendary among his peers. The mathematical impossibilities were staggering. Elevation changes that violated basic physics, magnetic readings that suggested the presence of metallic deposits in concentrations that would make the area one of the richest mineral sites in North America if they actually existed, and, most intriguingly, what appeared to be a consistent pattern underlying the chaos. "There's something here," he told Morrison, tracing his finger along lines that seemed to connect the various anomalies. "These aren't random errors. Someone or something has been very deliberately obscuring the true geography of this place." He agreed to take the assignment, but insisted on using his own equipment. Instruments calibrated to detect the subtle variations that often preceded major geographical discoveries, devices sensitive enough to measure gravitational fluctuations and electromagnetic fields that might explain the area's reputation for disorientation. The first 5 days of the survey proceeded with the methodical precision that had made Caldwell famous in geological circles. He established his base camp at the coordinates provided by the Forest Service, a relatively flat clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees that seemed unusually large for the region's typical growth patterns. His initial measurements confirmed many of the anomalies described in previous reports. Compass readings that varied by as much as 40 degrees depending on where he stood within a 10-foot radius, GPS coordinates that shifted slightly each time he powered his unit on and off, and elevation readings that suggested he was simultaneously at 1,847 feet and 1,923 feet above sea level, depending on which altimeter he consulted. The forest itself felt wrong in ways that went beyond the instrumental readings. Sounds carried differently here, with his own footsteps echoing back from directions where no solid surfaces existed, and the quality of light filtering through the canopy created shadows that seemed to move independently of the branches that cast them. His daily radio check-ins with his wife Sarah in their home base in Colorado followed their established routine, but by the 4th day, Sarah noticed subtle changes in Ethan's voice that triggered the instincts she'd developed during their 15 years together. "The trees here don't follow normal growth patterns," he reported during his evening call on September 6th. "I'm finding oak specimens that show ring patterns suggesting they're over 300 years old, but they're growing in perfect geometric formations, like someone planted them in mathematical sequences. And, Sarah, I keep finding survey markers from expeditions that don't match any historical records. Bronze markers with dates from the 1800s, but using surveying symbols that weren't standardized until the 1950s. She could hear something in his voice that she'd never detected before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of intellectual vertigo that came from encountering something that challenged his fundamental understanding of how the physical world operated." September 7th brought the first truly disturbing developments. Ethan's morning radio call came 3 hours later than scheduled, and when he finally made contact, his voice carried an edge of barely controlled excitement mixed with something approaching awe. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully and write down exactly what I'm telling you," he began, speaking with the deliberate precision he used when documenting critical findings. "I've been walking in what I thought was a straight line for the past 6 hours, following a deer trail that showed up clearly on yesterday's reconnaissance photos. According to my pedometer, I've covered nearly 18 miles, but my GPS shows I'm exactly 47 feet from where I started this morning. The trail itself is impossible. It maintains a consistent 2-degree downward slope, but I've been climbing steadily according to my altimeter, gaining over 800 feet in elevation while walking downhill." He paused, and Sarah could hear the sound of papers rustling. "I found something else. There's a structure here, Sarah. Stone foundations laid out in a pattern that matches Celtic design principles, but using construction techniques I've never seen before. The stones are fitted together without mortar, but they're joined so precisely that I can't slide a knife blade between them, and they're warm to the touch, even though the air temperature is barely 50 degrees. The morning of September 8th marked a turning point that would haunt Sarah Caldwell for the rest of her life. Ethan's radio call came precisely on schedule, but the voice that emerged from the static sounded like her husband speaking from the bottom of a well. "The map is changing," he reported, his words slow and deliberate as if he was struggling to find adequate language for what he was experiencing. "I'm documenting topographical features that shift configuration overnight. A ridge that ran north-south yesterday is now oriented east-west, but the vegetation growing on it shows decades of wind patterns that match the original alignment. Sarah, I think I'm mapping something that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously." The radio crackled with interference that sounded almost like whispers in a language she couldn't identify. I found another surveyor's camp today, equipment scattered as if someone left in a hurry. The instruments are models that won't be manufactured for another 20 years, according to the serial numbers. There was a journal entry dated next month, describing this exact location, but referring to geographical features I haven't discovered yet. September 9th shattered the last vestiges of normalcy. Ethan's voice, when it finally emerged from the static-filled radio transmission that evening, carried a quality that made Sarah's hands tremble as she gripped the receiver. "I understand now why they needed this place mapped," he whispered, speaking so quietly she had to strain to hear him. "It's not that the geography is unstable. It's that multiple geographies exist in the same space, layered on top of each other like transparent sheets. When I walk north, I'm simultaneously walking east in a parallel configuration of the same landscape. The trees I'm seeing aren't just growing in patterns, Sarah. They're marking transition points between different versions of this forest." The transmission grew weaker, punctuated by bursts of static that seemed to form recognizable patterns, like Morse code in a frequency just beyond human comprehension. "I found the town today. It's not on any map because it exists in the spaces between maps. The people there have been waiting for someone who could chart the pathways between realities. They've been waiting for me." The radio went silent for nearly a minute before Ethan's voice returned, now carrying an undertone of wonder that chilled Sarah more than any expression of fear could have. "Some territories aren't meant to be explored, Sarah. They're meant to be inhabited." September 10th brought no radio contact despite Sarah's increasingly frantic attempts to reach her husband. By noon, she was on the phone with the Kentucky Forest Service, and by evening, a full search and rescue operation was mobilizing with Captain Dale Morrison leading a team of experienced mountain rescue specialists. Morrison had handled dozens of missing person cases in the Appalachian region, but he would later tell investigators that the moment his team entered the fold, he knew they were dealing with something beyond conventional search and rescue protocols. Their radio communications with base camp became sporadic within the first hour, filled with interference that seemed to respond to their movements, growing louder when they headed in certain directions, fading to whispers when they changed course. GPS units displayed coordinates that placed them simultaneously in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia, while compass readings fluctuated wildly, sometimes pointing toward magnetic north, sometimes toward geographical features that didn't appear on any topographical survey. They found Ethan's base camp on the morning of September 11th, and the discovery would become the stuff of legend among search and rescue professionals throughout the region. The camp itself was exactly where it should have been according to his last known coordinates, his tent properly staked and weatherproofed, his personal belongings neatly organized as if he'd stepped away for a brief reconnaissance mission. But his surveying equipment told a different story entirely. Every instrument had been removed from storage and arranged in a precise geometric pattern that extended nearly 60 feet from the tent in all directions, each device positioned at mathematically exact intervals that would have required hours of calculation to determine and implement. His transit sat at the exact center of the configuration, its telescope pointed straight up at the forest canopy, while his measuring chains formed concentric circles around it with each link aligned to create a pattern that resembled an enormous compass rose when viewed from above. Captain Morrison, a pragmatic man who'd spent 30 years in mountain rescue work, found himself staring at the arrangement with growing unease. "It would have taken all night to position these instruments with this level of precision," he told his team, crouching beside a theodolite that had been placed exactly 17.5 feet from the tent's entrance at an angle that corresponded to magnetic north with mathematical perfection. But why would an experienced surveyor abandon thousands of dollars worth of equipment in the middle of a wilderness area? The answer lay scattered across Ethan's drafting table, weighted down with stones that had been carved with symbols that resembled surveying marks but followed no standardized system Morrison had ever encountered. Ethan's maps covered the table's surface in overlapping layers, each one more impossible than the last, showing elevations that climbed from the region's actual 1,800-foot baseline to peaks that reached over 15,000 feet, despite the area being relatively flat according to every official survey. But it was Ethan's journal entries that transformed the search from a missing person case into something that challenged the rescue team's understanding of physical reality. Written in his distinctive, precise handwriting, the entries documented experiences that seemed to span weeks despite covering only 9 days of actual time. Day 12 discovered that the forest exists in multiple temporal layers, read one entry dated September 15th, 6 days in the future. The deer trails I've been following were created by animals that lived here before European settlement, but they're still being used by herds that won't exist for decades. Another entry, dated 3 weeks beyond his disappearance, described topographical features in technical detail. The Spiral Valley system descends through 7 distinct ecological zones, each one corresponding to a different geological era. Found fossilized remains of species that became extinct in other locations but continue to thrive in the deeper levels of this dimensional fold. Morrison's team spent 5 days conducting the most thorough search of their careers, following every possible trail, exploring every cave system, checking every overhang and depression where a person might seek shelter or become trapped. They brought in tracking dogs whose behavior became increasingly erratic the deeper they ventured into the forest, howling at empty clearings, following scent trails that led to solid rock faces, refusing to proceed beyond certain invisible boundaries that seemed to shift location each day. Thermal imaging equipment detected heat signatures that corresponded to human body temperature, but when teams investigated, they found only unusual rock formations that radiated warmth despite the cooling autumn air. Most disturbing were the experiences reported by individual team members: compass readings that pointed toward features they could see but couldn't reach, GPS coordinates that placed them at locations they'd searched the previous day despite being miles from those sites, and the persistent sensation of being observed from the dense canopy above, as if something with intelligence was tracking their movements and evaluating their intentions. The search was officially suspended after 2 weeks, though Morrison filed a report that would become legendary among search and rescue professionals throughout the Appalachian region. Subject appears to have vanished under circumstances that preclude standard missing person protocols, he wrote in language carefully chosen to convey the impossibility of the situation without sounding delusional. Physical evidence suggests a deliberate arrangement of equipment in patterns requiring advanced mathematical knowledge, while recovered documentation contains geographical data that contradicts all known topographical surveys of the region. Recommend area be classified as hazardous due to unusual magnetic phenomena and documented cases of equipment malfunction. Privately, Morrison told colleagues that he'd never encountered a missing person case where the evidence seemed to point toward voluntary departure to a destination that couldn't exist within known physical parameters. 3 months after Ethan's disappearance, Sarah received a package that changed her understanding of what had happened to her husband. Delivered by a postal service truck whose driver insisted he'd picked it up from a post office in Pine Ridge, Kentucky, despite the local postmaster's sworn testimony that no such package had been processed through their facility, the package contained items that defied rational explanation. Ethan's wedding ring was wrapped in tissue paper that felt ancient despite appearing new, accompanied by a folded sheet of his surveying graph paper covered in calculations that used mathematical principles Sarah had never encountered. The formulas appeared to describe three-dimensional space in terms of multiple overlapping geometries, with notations in Ethan's handwriting that referenced transition vectors and dimensional folding coefficients, using terminology that didn't exist in any surveying textbook. But it was the letter that accompanied these items that finally provided Sarah with something approaching closure, though the knowledge it contained would haunt her dreams for years to come. Written in Ethan's familiar hand on paper that seemed to shimmer with an inner light, the letter described discoveries that challenged every assumption about the nature of physical reality. My dearest Sarah, I need you to understand that my disappearance wasn't an accident or a tragedy. It was a completion. The fold isn't a geographical anomaly. It's a junction point where multiple versions of the same landscape exist simultaneously, layered like pages in a book that can be read from different angles. The people who live here aren't missing. They're cartographers like me, who discovered that some territories can only be mapped from the inside. The letter continued with descriptions of a community that existed in the spaces between conventional reality, populated by surveyors, geologists, and explorers who had found their way to places that couldn't be reached through normal travel. We're still doing the work we were meant to do, Sarah, but on a scale that encompasses dimensions beyond the physical world you know. The maps we're creating here will eventually help others find their way to territories that exist in the realm of pure possibility. The Forest Service quietly removed the fold from their official trail maps following Morrison's report, and local authorities stopped organizing search parties after 3 separate rescue attempts resulted in additional disappearances. But the area continues to draw unauthorized expeditions, researchers armed with copies of Ethan's impossible maps, thrill seekers attracted by stories of geographical anomalies, and desperate family members of other missing persons who've heard whispers that the fold might be a doorway to places where the disappeared continue to exist. Sarah Caldwell established a foundation dedicated to studying unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas, though she's never returned to Kentucky or attempted to follow the mathematical pathways described in her husband's final letter. She keeps his surveying instruments in her Colorado home, and sometimes on quiet evenings when the mountain air carries sounds from impossible distances, she claims the equipment still hums with energy, as if responding to signals from territories that exist beyond the boundaries of any earthly map, where skilled cartographers spend eternity charting the infinite spaces between what is and what could be. Case 2. 3 Days in Spruce Pine. Detective Marcus Rivera had built his career on patterns, the methodical recognition of behavioral sequences that separated random crime from calculated malice, the subtle connections that transformed isolated incidents into prosecutable cases, and most importantly, the ability to see order in chaos that others dismissed as coincidence. After 12 years with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, Rivera had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect the threads that linked seemingly unrelated disappearances, which made his assignment to the Spruce Pine cases both inevitable and deeply unsettling. 7 hikers had vanished from the Blue Ridge Mountains over an 18-month period, each disappearance occurring during the 3-day window surrounding the new moon, each victim last seen entering trail systems that experienced local guides described as temperamental, paths that seemed to change configuration depending on atmospheric conditions, lunar phases, and what old-timers called the mountain's mood. The case file that landed on Rivera's desk in late September read like a catalog of impossibilities wrapped in bureaucratic language designed to obscure rather than illuminate the truth. Jennifer Walsh, an experienced backpacker from Asheville, had vanished from the Grandfather Mountain Trail system during the October 2023 new moon, leaving behind a campsite so perfectly preserved that investigating officers initially suspected she'd simply stepped away for a brief hike and would return momentarily. Her tent remained zipped shut with all personal belongings inside, her food properly stored in bear canisters, and her hiking boots placed neatly beside the tent entrance as if she'd removed them before entering for the night. Except thermal imaging conducted the following morning showed no body heat signature inside the sleeping bag, and her boots contained no trace of the red clay soil characteristic of the area where her camp was located. 2 months later, David Chen, a geology graduate student conducting mineral surveys near Mount Mitchell, disappeared during the December new moon under equally mystifying circumstances. His research equipment found arranged in precise geometric patterns around a campfire that had burned continuously for 3 days despite the absence of anyone to tend it. Rivera's initial investigation followed standard missing person protocols, but the deeper he delved into the case histories, the more convinced he became that these weren't random disappearances but carefully orchestrated events following a pattern that suggested intelligence, planning, and an understanding of human behavior that bordered on the preternatural. Each victim had been an experienced outdoor enthusiast with extensive knowledge of mountain survival techniques. Each had informed multiple people of their planned route and expected return date, and each had vanished during the narrow window, when lunar darkness was at its most complete. More disturbing were the details that emerged from witness interviews. Local residents reported unusual animal behavior during the nights preceding each disappearance, with domestic dogs refusing to venture outside after sunset and wildlife sounds following patterns that longtime mountain dwellers described as conversations in languages we don't understand. The breakthrough came when Rivera discovered that all 7 disappearances had occurred within a 12-mile radius of an area that locals called the Breathing Caves, a network of limestone caverns that had been sealed by the Forest Service in 1987, following a series of accidents involving cavers who reported experiencing disorientation, temporal displacement, and acoustic phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional speleology. The official records cited unstable geological conditions and dangerous atmospheric gases, but Rivera's investigation uncovered incident reports that painted a far more disturbing picture. Cave exploration teams had reported discovering chambers that appeared on no geological survey, underground rivers that flowed uphill against gravity, and most unnervingly, evidence of recent human habitation in caverns that had supposedly been untouched for millennia. Fresh food stores, modern camping equipment, and journal entries written in languages that linguistic experts couldn't identify but described as structurally similar to English but operating according to grammatical principles that don't exist in known human languages. Rivera's request to investigate the sealed cave system was initially denied by both the Forest Service and his own superiors, but the disappearance of Maria Santos during the February new moon provided him with the leverage he needed to gain access. Santos, a professional mountaineering guide with 20 years of experience in high-altitude rescue operations, had vanished while leading a training expedition for Park Service personnel, leaving behind equipment that told a story more disturbing than any of the previous cases. Her climbing gear had been methodically arranged to form what appeared to be a primitive pulley system extending into a crevice that geological surveys indicated should have been solid bedrock, while her radio had been tuned to a frequency that broadcast continuous transmission of what sounded like human voices, speaking in harmonious patterns that resembled music more than conversation. The audio analysis revealed that the transmissions contained mathematical sequences that corresponded to the lunar calendar with precision accurate to within seconds, suggesting knowledge of astronomical phenomena that would require advanced scientific equipment to calculate. Armed with court orders and a hazmat team equipped to handle potentially toxic atmospheric conditions, Rivera entered the breathing caves on March 18th, 2 days before the new moon, accompanied by 3 experienced cave rescue specialists and a geologist from the University of North Carolina, who had been studying the area's unusual magnetic properties. The cave system they discovered bore no resemblance to the sealed limestone caverns described in Forest Service records. Instead of narrow passages and unstable formations, they found expansive chambers connected by tunnels that had been carved with precision that suggested advanced engineering knowledge and tools far more sophisticated than anything available to prehistoric inhabitants. The walls showed evidence of deliberate construction, with smooth surfaces that curved according to mathematical principles Rivera recognized from architectural studies, while the floor patterns consisted of inlaid stones arranged in spirals that created acoustic effects that turned whispers into harmonized echoes. The first chamber they explored contained evidence that transformed Rivera's missing person investigation into something that challenged his fundamental understanding of criminal behavior and human capability. Personal belongings from all 7 missing hikers had been arranged in careful displays around the chamber's perimeter, not scattered randomly as if dropped during a struggle, but organized according to some systematic principle that suggested ritual purpose and deep knowledge of each individual's personal history. Jennifer Walsh's hiking boots were positioned at the exact center of a circle formed by David Chen's geological samples, while Maria Santos's climbing harness had been suspended from the chamber ceiling at a height that required sophisticated rigging techniques to achieve. Most disturbing were the journal entries they discovered, pages torn from notebooks belonging to each missing person, but containing writing that documented experiences spanning months or years despite the fact that the longest anyone had been missing was 18 months. Rivera's geologist companion, Dr. Amanda Foster, quickly became fascinated by the chamber's acoustic properties, which seemed to amplify certain frequencies while dampening others according to patterns that corresponded to the lunar calendar they'd discovered in Maria Santos's radio transmissions. "These aren't natural cave formations," she told Rivera as they explored deeper into the system, her voice carrying an edge of excitement that made him increasingly uncomfortable. "The mathematical precision of these constructions suggests knowledge of advanced acoustics, astronomy, and engineering that would challenge modern architects. Someone or something has been modifying these caves for generations, creating an environment designed to interact with specific atmospheric and astronomical conditions." She demonstrated by speaking at different volumes and frequencies, showing how the chamber seemed to respond to certain vocal patterns by generating harmonized echoes that created the impression of multiple voices engaged in complex musical conversations. The second day of their investigation brought discoveries that forced Rivera to question whether he was dealing with kidnapping, murder, or something that fell outside the categories of conventional criminal law. Hidden passages led to chambers that contained what appeared to be living spaces. Sleeping areas constructed with sophisticated knowledge of cave ecology, food preparation areas that utilized natural water sources and ventilation systems, and, most unnervingly, libraries consisting of thousands of pages of handwritten documentation in multiple languages, including English entries that detailed the daily experiences of people who had supposedly vanished years ago. The writing described a community that existed in the spaces between surface reality and underground mystery, populated by individuals who had chosen to abandon conventional existence in favor of something that offered deeper understanding of natural patterns and astronomical cycles. The final entry in Rivera's official case file, dated March 20th, consisted of a single paragraph that would become the subject of intense speculation among his colleagues for years to come. Investigation suspended due to equipment malfunction and communication failures that prevented continuation of cave exploration, according to established safety protocols. Recommend case be transferred to federal jurisdiction due to potential national security implications related to discovery of advanced technological installations of unknown origin. But Rivera's personal notes, discovered by his partner Detective Sarah Kim when she became concerned about his failure to report for duty the following week, told a different story entirely. Written in his characteristic precise handwriting but using vocabulary and concepts that seemed foreign to his usual analytical approach, the notes described encounters with individuals he identified as the missing hikers, now living as part of an underground community that had been attracting selected surface dwellers for decades. They weren't kidnapped, Rivera had written in his final personal entry, dated March 21st, the night of the new moon. They were invited to participate in something that requires voluntary commitment and gradual adaptation to environmental conditions that don't exist on the surface. The cave system extends for hundreds of miles through multiple states, connecting communities that have learned to live according to natural cycles that modern civilization has forgotten. The people here aren't missing. They're pioneers exploring ways of existence that integrate human consciousness with geological and astronomical patterns that operate on timescales beyond individual lifetimes. The notes continued with detailed descriptions of technologies that utilized natural cave acoustics to create communication networks spanning vast distances, agricultural techniques adapted to underground ecosystems, and social structures based on astronomical cycles that required individuals to spend specific periods in surface and underground environments according to lunar phases. Detective Sarah Kim's investigation into Rivera's disappearance followed the same pattern that had characterized the original hiking cases. A methodical search that uncovered evidence suggesting voluntary departure rather than foul play, personal belongings arranged with deliberate care rather than abandoned in panic, and documentation that described experiences beyond the scope of conventional reality. The breathing caves were permanently sealed following Rivera's disappearance, with concrete barriers and warning signs that cited geological instability and dangerous atmospheric conditions. But local residents report that the barriers show signs of being regularly opened and resealed according to patterns that correspond to lunar cycles. Sarah Kim maintains the case files in active status despite pressure from superiors to classify the disappearances as resolved through presumed death, and she continues to receive periodic communications from addresses that can't be traced through conventional postal systems, letters written in Rivera's handwriting that describe ongoing investigative work in territories that exist beneath the boundaries of surface jurisdiction, where dedicated law enforcement professionals spend their careers pursuing cases that span multiple dimensions of reality and require detective skills adapted to mysteries that operate according to principles beyond conventional criminal law. The Spruce Pine cases remain officially unsolved, though the area continues to attract individuals during new moon periods. Researchers drawn by stories of advanced underground civilizations, spiritual seekers attracted to reports of communities living in harmony with natural cycles, and law enforcement professionals who've heard whispers that some missing person cases can only be solved by investigators willing to follow evidence trails that lead beyond the boundaries of surface reality into territories where the disappeared continue their chosen work in environments designed for those who understand that some mysteries are meant to be lived rather than merely observed. Case 3. The Woodwright's Daughter. Isabel Thorne had inherited more than her great-grandfather's abandoned cabin when she decided to leave her corporate furniture design job in Richmond. She'd inherited a bloodline that stretched back 5 generations of master craftsmen who had earned legendary status throughout the Appalachian Mountains for creating objects that defied conventional understanding of what wood could become in skilled hands. The Thorne family workshop, nestled in a hollow so narrow that direct sunlight only penetrated the forest canopy for 3 hours each day, had produced furniture and carvings sought after by collectors from Virginia to Georgia, pieces distinguished not merely by technical excellence but by an indefinable quality that made observers describe them as more alive than dead wood should be. The decision to revive the family tradition came in October 2023, after Isabel spent a decade growing increasingly frustrated with mass production techniques that treated timber as industrial material rather than living substance with its own history and personality. Her great-grandfather's workshop had remained untouched since his death in 1987, slowly surrendering to mountain humidity, but still containing the tools he'd spent 60 years perfecting. Hand-forged chisels that held edges sharper than modern steel, planes that whispered through wood grain with supernatural precision, and workbenches worn smooth by generations of use. Most intriguingly, the shop contained a collection of seasoned lumber-bearing cryptic labels in spidery handwriting, harvested during the Crying Moon, 1952, seasoned in the Singing Cave, ready, 1975, and Black Walnut, touched by lightning, use only when mountain sleeps. Isabel initially dismissed these labels as colorful mountain folklore, the kind of mystical terminology that rural craftsmen often use to add romance to practical processes. But within her first week in the isolated hollow, experiences began that challenged her rational understanding of woodworking and reality itself. The dreams started as fragmentary visions of carved patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, symbols that resembled no traditional woodworking she'd studied in design school or encountered in museum collections, yet felt familiar in ways that suggested genetic memory or knowledge passed through bloodlines deeper than conscious learning. Each night, the dream patterns grew more complex and detailed. Geometric forms that incorporated elements of Celtic knotwork, Native American totemic designs, and mathematical spirals that seemed to describe natural processes like tree growth rings, underground water flow, and the seasonal migration patterns of mountain wildlife. The symbols appeared with increasing clarity as October progressed, arriving in her sleeping mind with technical precision that included specific measurements, grain directions, and carving depths that would require advanced mathematical knowledge to calculate during waking hours. Most disturbing was the consistency. Each dream built upon previous visions, as if her unconscious mind was receiving detailed blueprints transmitted from an external source that understood both her capabilities and the projects she hadn't yet begun. By November, Isabel found herself compulsively sketching these dream symbols during daylight hours, filling notebook after notebook with designs that grew increasingly sophisticated despite her conscious mind having no understanding of their meaning or purpose. The sketches seemed to guide her hands independently of her intentions, creating patterns that required geometric precision she'd never possessed and incorporated woodworking techniques that weren't taught in any program she'd studied. Her attempts to research the symbols through online databases and regional historical societies yielded only fragmentary references in academic papers on Appalachian folk traditions. Articles describing similar patterns carved into trees throughout the mountains during the 18th and 19th centuries, symbols that mainstream historians dismissed as territorial markers, but that cultural anthropologists suggested might represent a sophisticated written language developed by isolated communities to record complex information about seasonal changes, weather patterns, and the behavior of local wildlife. The transformation from curious dreams to terrifying reality began when Isabel discovered her great-grandfather's hidden journal, concealed inside a hollowed-out section of his primary workbench and wrapped in oiled leather that had protected the pages from decades of mountain humidity. Written in English mixed with phonetic transcriptions of what appeared to be an unknown language, the journal documented experiences that explained both the source of her dream symbols and the true nature of 5 generations of Thorn craftsmanship that had produced objects described by their owners as possessing almost supernatural qualities. The patterns choose their own expression through willing hands, her great-grandfather had written in an entry dated September 1952. We don't impose designs upon the wood. We remove excess material that prevents the natural patterns from emerging. Each tree contains its own story, written in the growth rings by seasonal changes, weather patterns, soil composition, and the influence of underground mineral deposits that create unique grain characteristics. Our responsibility as craftsmen is to listen carefully enough to hear what the wood wants to become, then provide the technical skill necessary to help it achieve its intended form. The journal entries described techniques that went far beyond conventional woodworking, involving precise timing based on lunar phases, atmospheric pressure changes, and what her great-grandfather called the mountain's breathing patterns. Subtle shifts in air currents and humidity that indicated optimal conditions for working with timber that had been seasoned according to traditional methods passed down through generations. The dream symbols Isabel had been experiencing appeared throughout the journal as detailed technical drawings, accompanied by instructions that read like a combination of engineering specifications and ritualistic procedures, specific wood types that could only be harvested during particular weather conditions, carving tools that required preparation using spring water from designated mountain sources, and most unnervingly, references to ongoing collaboration with the valley's original inhabitants. These entities, according to her great-grandfather's careful documentation, existed in the spaces between fully human and entirely other, beings that had taught the first thorn craftsmen the techniques necessary to create objects that served as bridges between the physical world and dimensions of existence that operated according to natural laws different from those governing normal reality. The journal described decades of interaction with these teachers, who appeared during specific atmospheric conditions and guided selected family members through apprenticeships that gradually revealed techniques for creating living wood, carved objects that continued to evolve and develop new properties long after their initial completion. Isabel's first attempt to carve the dream symbols using her great-grandfather's documented methods produced results that challenged everything she thought she understood about how wood should behave under normal circumstances. Working with a section of black walnut that had been seasoned for over 30 years according to the mysterious cave-aging process described in the journal, she found that her carving tools seemed to guide themselves along grain patterns that hadn't been visible before she began working. The wood revealed intricate natural designs that appeared to have been growing within its cellular structure for decades, waiting for the right combination of technical skill and intuitive understanding to bring them to the surface. The symbols emerged with minimal resistance, as if the timber was eager to release patterns that had been constrained by outer layers of ordinary wood grain, and when she completed the first panel after 3 days of careful work, Isabel discovered that the carved surface generated subtle musical tones when touched or exposed to changes in atmospheric pressure. The sounds weren't random creaking or settling noises, but harmonious frequencies that seemed to resonate with the natural acoustics of the mountain valley, creating the impression that her carved panel was participating in an ongoing conversation with similar objects scattered throughout the region. December brought increasingly vivid dreams that expanded far beyond simple pattern recognition to include detailed visions of the valley's hidden history, populated by figures she somehow knew were her ancestors despite their appearance being subtly different from normal human proportions. These dream ancestors possessed elongated limbs perfectly adapted for precision work, hands with additional joints that allowed manipulation of tools in ways that defied normal anatomy, and eyes that reflected available light with unusual intensity, suggesting adaptation to working in low-light conditions that characterized the narrow mountain hollow where generations of thorn craftsmen had perfected their mysterious techniques. The ancestral figures in her dreams demonstrated advanced methods that weren't recorded in any woodworking manual she'd studied, techniques for reading tree bark patterns to determine optimal harvest timing, ways of seasoning lumber using underground chambers that maintained constant temperature and humidity through unknown means, and, most importantly, the proper procedures for creating what they called living carvings, objects that continued to grow and develop new characteristics as they interacted with their environment and the people who used them regularly. As Isabel's carved panels accumulated in the workshop, they began exhibiting behaviors that forced her to question whether she was creating decorative art objects or functional devices that served purposes beyond conventional craft categories. The completed symbols generated different musical tones depending on weather conditions, atmospheric pressure changes, and the phase of the moon, producing harmonized frequencies that seemed to communicate with similar objects throughout the valley in a network of wooden instruments created by previous generations of thorn craftsmen and distributed to homes, churches, and public buildings where they continued their mysterious function decades after their creators had died. Most unsettling was Isabel's growing realization that the carved symbols weren't merely decorative elements but served as detailed instructions or navigational maps that described pathways through the mountain landscape. Routes that existed in dimensions beyond normal physical geography and could only be followed by individuals who understood the symbolic language encoded in the living wood. The panels functioned as doorways or communication devices, allowing access to territories that overlapped with but weren't limited by the conventional three-dimensional space that constrained ordinary human movement and perception. Isabel's final journal entry, discovered by concerned neighbors when she failed to appear at the local general store for her weekly supply run, was dated December 21st, the winter solstice, and written in the same mixture of English and unknown phonetic symbols that characterized her great-grandfather's hidden records. The work is reaching completion, but completion in this tradition isn't an ending. It's translation into a different form of existence that requires direct participation rather than observation from a safe distance, she had written in her careful script, which had gradually become more angular and precise throughout the autumn months. The symbols I've been carving weren't dreams or artistic inspiration. They were invitations to join the community of craftsmen who have been working in collaboration with the valley's original inhabitants for over 2 centuries. The carved panels serve as doorways between layers of reality that exist in the same geographical space but operate according to different natural laws. Creating them properly requires the craftsman to gradually adapt to environmental conditions that exist in the spaces between the purely physical and the purely spiritual worlds, developing capabilities that allow direct interaction with intelligences that have been guiding human development in directions that mainstream civilization can't recognize or acknowledge. When neighbors investigated Isabel's absence, they found her workshop arranged exactly as she had left it, with tools positioned in precise geometric patterns around partially completed carvings that seemed to continue evolving despite the absence of anyone to work on them. The panels she had successfully carved generated increasingly complex musical patterns during certain weather conditions, harmonizing with similar sounds that seemed to emerge from other locations throughout the valley where Thorne family pieces had been placed over the past 5 generations. The local sheriff's investigation concluded that Isabel had most likely suffered an accident while hiking in the surrounding wilderness, though extensive searches covering every accessible trail and cave system within a 20-mile radius found no trace of her. But the Thorne workshop continues to attract visitors drawn by stories of woodworking techniques that produce results impossible to achieve through conventional methods. Craftsmen seeking to understand how carved wood can generate musical harmonies that respond to atmospheric changes, musicians fascinated by reports of instruments that create frequencies beyond normal acoustic principles, and researchers studying the intersection between traditional Appalachian craftsmanship and phenomena that operate according to natural laws not recognized by mainstream science. Isabel's panels remain active in the abandoned workshop, continuing their mysterious evolution and producing sounds that local residents describe as conversations between the living wood and whatever intelligences dwell in the deep places of the mountain, while her incomplete projects seem to progress toward completion according to their own internal schedules, as if guided by the invisible hands of craftsmen who work in dimensions parallel to physical reality, where dedicated artisans spend their time creating objects that serve as bridges between worlds and require skills that can only be mastered by those willing to surrender conventional human existence in favor of collaboration with ancient intelligences that have been teaching selected individuals the true principles of creation for far longer than recorded history has been able to document. Case 4. Signal Lost Park Ranger. Javier Santos had spent 8 years patrolling the remote sections of Cherokee National Forest, but the radio protocols that governed his safety had never failed him until the storm that swept through the Tennessee mountains on March 15, 2024, a late winter tempest that brought horizontal rain, lightning strikes that turned night into strobing daylight, and atmospheric interference that reduced radio communications to bursts of static punctuated by voices speaking in languages that shouldn't have existed on any frequency accessible to standard Forest Service equipment. Santos was conducting his routine evening patrol when the weather deteriorated beyond safe driving conditions, forcing him to take shelter at Ranger Station 12, an isolated outpost situated at the convergence of 3 hiking trails that local Cherokee elders had always described with obvious reluctance, referring to it as the place where different worlds meet during storms. The station's emergency generator kicked in as the main power failed, and Santos settled in for what he expected to be a long night of monitoring weather reports and maintaining radio contact with dispatch every 30 minutes according to established protocols. His first check-in at 8:47 p.m. proceeded normally, with clear reception and routine weather updates, but by 9:15 p.m., the radio was picking up transmissions that weren't coming from any Forest Service frequency. Voices speaking in what sounded like Cherokee dialect mixed with English, discussing trail conditions and wildlife movements with technical precision that suggested official Park Service communications, yet referencing locations and landmarks that didn't appear on any map Santos had studied during his years of service in the region. The voices grew more distinct as the storm intensified, and Santos found himself responding to radio calls that seemed to be directed specifically at him, conversations that felt completely natural until he realized that dispatch headquarters had no record of transmitting any communications to his station after 9 p.m. Ranger Station 12, this is Central Command, requesting status update on the Crying Rock Trail closure, came a voice that sounded exactly like his supervisor, District Chief Margaret Whitehorse, discussing a trail that Santos knew had been permanently closed since a rockslide in 1987. When he responded with confusion, asking for clarification about which trail system the voice was referencing, the radio fell silent for several minutes before a different voice, also unmistakably Chief Whitehorse, but speaking with an accent and vocabulary patterns that seemed subtly different, began discussing weather conditions and evacuation procedures for areas of the forest that Santos had never heard mentioned in any official documentation. As the night progressed, Santos found himself engaged in increasingly surreal radio conversations with colleagues whose voices he recognized perfectly but who seemed to be working in a version of Cherokee National Forest that operated according to different geographical and administrative parameters. The voices discussed rescue operations for hikers who had been missing for decades, trail maintenance projects in sections of wilderness that Santos knew were designated as completely inaccessible, and, most unnervingly, ongoing radio communications with his own station that were supposedly taking place simultaneously with the conversations he was actually having. According to the voices on the radio, Ranger Javier Santos was currently out on patrol, responding to multiple emergency situations throughout the forest, while the Santos sitting in the station was somehow a different person entirely. The breakthrough in understanding came when Santos discovered that the station's security cameras, which operated on an independent power system, were recording footage that didn't match his direct observations of his own activities. While he sat at the radio desk responding to the mysterious transmissions, the video feed showed him moving around the station, suiting up in foul weather gear, and departing into the storm to respond to emergency calls that he had no memory of receiving. The recorded Santos moved with purpose and familiarity, checking equipment and consulting maps that showed trail systems the conscious Santos didn't recognize before disappearing into the forest to conduct rescue operations that were being coordinated through radio channels the observing Santos couldn't access. Most disturbing was the audio analysis Santos conducted using the station's digital recording equipment, which revealed that the mysterious radio transmissions contained voices speaking in Cherokee dialect that had been extinct for over 2 centuries. Linguistic patterns that academic experts had reconstructed from historical documents but that no living person should have been able to speak fluently. The technical knowledge displayed by these voices was unmistakably modern, discussing GPS coordinates, weather satellite data, and emergency medical procedures using current Forest Service terminology, yet delivered in a language that predated European contact with Cherokee territories by hundreds of years. The voices seemed to be coordinating search and rescue operations in areas of the forest that existed in some parallel version of the landscape, where different historical outcomes had preserved indigenous languages and territorial boundaries that had been erased in the conventional timeline. Santos's final radio transmission, recorded automatically by the station's emergency systems, occurred at 3:17 a.m. as the storm began to subside and normal communications were slowly being restored throughout the region. His voice, speaking with perfect clarity despite the background static, delivered a detailed status report that documented successful rescue operations in 7 different locations throughout the forest, describing the medical treatment and evacuation of hikers whose names and descriptions matched missing persons reports from cases spanning the previous 40 years. All personnel accounted for and safely transported to medical facilities in the parallel district, Santos reported in his distinctive voice but using terminology that wasn't part of standard Forest Service protocols. Weather conditions in the convergence zone returning to baseline parameters. Station 12 maintaining communications with both operational timelines until atmospheric interference completely dissipates. When the morning shift arrived at Ranger Station 12, they found the facility exactly as Santos should have left it. Equipment properly secured, logbooks updated with routine weather observations, and no indication of any emergency activity during the night. But Santos himself was nowhere to be found, despite his vehicle being parked in its designated spot and his personal belongings remaining undisturbed in the station's living quarters. The security camera footage showed him departing into the storm multiple times throughout the night, each time returning to complete different administrative tasks, but the final departure at 3:20 a.m. showed him walking into the forest without any protective gear, moving with confident familiarity along a trail that led directly into terrain that topographical surveys indicated was impassable due to steep cliffs and unstable rock formations. The official investigation concluded that Santos had become disoriented during the severe weather conditions and suffered an accident while attempting to respond to emergency calls that may have been hallucinations caused by the isolation and stress of the storm situation. But the recorded radio transmissions presented evidence that challenged this explanation, Conversations that demonstrated detailed knowledge of Forest Service procedures and Cherokee National Forest geography that extended far beyond the areas Santos had been authorized to patrol, discussions of rescue operations that were later confirmed to have resulted in the discovery of human remains matching several cold case missing persons files, and, most puzzling, communications that seemed to be coordinating search and rescue activities between multiple versions of the same forest that existed in parallel timelines or dimensions. The Cherokee National Forest authorities quietly installed new communication equipment at Ranger Station 12, implementing protocols designed to prevent the kind of atmospheric interference that had characterized the night of Santos's disappearance. But during severe weather conditions, rangers continue to report receiving transmissions in extinct Cherokee dialects coordinating emergency operations in areas of the forest that don't appear on official maps. Local tribal elders, when approached for consultation about the linguistic content of these transmissions, confirmed that the voices are using grammatical structures and vocabulary that would require decades of study to master, yet discussing modern concepts and technologies with perfect fluency, as if the speakers exist in a cultural continuum where traditional knowledge was never interrupted by historical displacement and continues to evolve alongside contemporary developments. Javier Santos remains officially listed as missing, though periodic reports from hikers and other Forest Service personnel describe encounters with a ranger matching his description conducting search and rescue operations in remote areas of Cherokee National Forest during severe weather conditions, appearing to coordinate with dispatch through radio communications that can't be detected on standard frequencies, but seem to be directing successful rescue efforts for people who were thought to be permanently lost in the wilderness, suggesting that dedicated Park Service professionals sometimes discover that their true calling requires them to work in dimensions of reality where their skills can serve communities that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional government jurisdiction, protecting and serving visitors who travel between worlds through territories that remain forever wild, because they exist in the spaces between different versions of the same landscape. Case 5. The Midnight Census. Anna Brighton had spent 3 years conducting census surveys in rural communities throughout Appalachia, but the assignment she received in October 2024 challenged everything she thought she understood about the methodical process of documenting human populations in remote mountain settlements. The Bureau of the Census had tasked her with completing a comprehensive survey of Millbrook Hollow, a community in eastern Kentucky that had somehow been overlooked during the previous decade's official count, despite appearing on Postal Service records, utility company databases, and property tax assessments as an active settlement with an estimated population of 47 residents. The discrepancy had created bureaucratic complications that required resolution before the next federal funding cycle, making Anna's assignment both routine and mysteriously urgent in ways that her supervisors couldn't adequately explain. The drive to Millbrook Hollow took Anna through increasingly narrow mountain roads that seemed to follow no logical pattern, winding through valleys where cell phone coverage disappeared entirely and GPS coordinates became unreliable, forcing her to rely on handwritten directions provided by the local post office in the nearest town. The settlement, when she finally located it after 6 hours of searching, appeared exactly as described in the preliminary reports. A cluster of well-maintained houses scattered along a creek that ran clear and cold through a valley so narrow that the surrounding ridges blocked direct sunlight for most of the day. Smoke rose from several chimneys despite the mild October weather, and she could see evidence of recent activity in the form of freshly chopped firewood, vegetable gardens that showed signs of recent harvest, and laundry hanging on lines strung between trees that displayed the vibrant autumn colors characteristic of healthy Appalachian forests. Anna's initial approach to the census work followed her established protocols, beginning with a comprehensive walk through the settlement to document the physical structures and establish preliminary contact with residents who might be available for interviews during daylight hours. The houses, she observed, were built in traditional Appalachian style but showed modern improvements, updated electrical systems, satellite television equipment, and vehicles in various stages of repair that indicated ongoing mechanical work and regular use. Most encouraging was the evidence of community activity: a small general store with recent inventory visible through the windows, a church building with fresh paint and a sign advertising weekly services, and a one-room schoolhouse where children's artwork was displayed on bulletin boards alongside academic materials that suggested active educational programming. But her attempts to make contact with residents revealed the first disturbing aspect of Millbrook Hollow's demographics. Despite clear evidence of recent habitation throughout the settlement, Anna encountered no one during her first day of surveying. No people working in gardens, no children playing in yards, no adults conducting the routine activities that characterize active communities. The houses appeared occupied, with curtains moving slightly in response to air currents and sounds of daily life audible from within, running water, television broadcasts, conversations conducted in voices too muffled to understand clearly, but knocking on doors produced no responses, and attempts to peer through windows revealed rooms that seemed to shift and change configuration when she wasn't looking directly at them. The breakthrough came when Anna discovered the community's existing records in a filing cabinet inside the general store, which she accessed through an unlocked back door after determining that standard procedures for establishing contact weren't producing results. The records, meticulously maintained in ledgers that dated back to the settlement's founding in 1887, documented population changes, births, deaths, and migration patterns with bureaucratic precision that exceeded the standards used by most federal agencies. According to the ledgers, Millbrook Hollow's population had remained remarkably stable for over a century, fluctuating between 45 and 50 residents despite the economic pressures that had depopulated most similar mountain communities. Most intriguing were the names listed in the current population register, individuals whose birth dates would make them impossibly old, yet who were recorded as active community members participating in local governance, educational activities, and economic enterprises. The truly disturbing revelation came when Anna cross-referenced the community records with federal databases using her portable computer equipment, which revealed that many of the residents listed as current inhabitants of Millbrook Hollow had been reported missing from other locations throughout Appalachia over the past several decades. The names matched missing persons reports from Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Individuals who had disappeared during hiking trips, research expeditions, or routine travel through mountain regions and were presumed dead after extensive search efforts failed to locate them. According to Millbrook Hollow's records, these missing persons had arrived in the settlement at various times and had been gradually integrated into the community's social and economic structure, taking on roles that utilized their professional skills and educational backgrounds in ways that contributed to the settlement's mysterious stability and prosperity. Anna's investigation into the community's governmental structure revealed an administrative system that operated according to principles she'd never encountered in decades of census work. Millbrook Hollow maintained detailed records of interaction with federal, state, and local agencies, documenting tax payments, postal services, utility connections, and compliance with regulatory requirements through correspondence that appeared to be conducted with government offices that didn't exist in standard bureaucratic directories. The settlement's official status seemed to exist in a kind of administrative limbo, recognized by some agencies while remaining invisible to others, creating a situation where the community could maintain all the benefits of legal existence while avoiding the oversight and regulation that characterized normal municipal governance. Most unnervingly, Anna discovered that her own name appeared in Millbrook Hollow's records as a permanent resident, with documentation showing that she had moved to the community in November 2024 and had been assigned housing, employment, and civic responsibilities that utilized her expertise in demographic analysis and population management. The records indicated that she had voluntarily requested transfer to Millbrook Hollow after completing her census assignment, citing professional satisfaction with the community's approach to sustainable population maintenance and resource management. According to the ledgers, she had become the settlement's official liaison with federal census operations, responsible for ensuring that Millbrook Hollow's demographic data was properly integrated with national population databases while maintaining the community's privacy and autonomy. Anna's final report, submitted to the Bureau of the Census through electronic channels on November 3, 2024, documented the successful completion of her demographic survey and recommended that Millbrook Hollow be classified as a model sustainable community deserving of special recognition for its innovative approaches to rural population retention and economic development. The report described 47 active residents engaged in traditional and contemporary occupations, educational achievement levels that exceeded national averages, and social cohesion indicators that suggested exceptional community stability and satisfaction. Most significantly, the report requested that Anna be permitted to remain in Millbrook Hollow as a permanent field representative, continuing her census work while studying the community's methods for maintaining population stability in rural areas where demographic decline had become a persistent challenge. When Census Bureau supervisors attempted to contact Anna for clarification about her unusual request and the remarkable demographic data she'd reported, they discovered that all communication with Millbrook Hollow had become impossible. Phone numbers that no longer connected to working lines, postal addresses that generated returned mail, and GPS coordinates that led to uninhabited valleys where no evidence of human settlement could be detected. Subsequent investigations by federal and state authorities failed to locate any trace of the community Anna had described, despite her detailed documentation and the bureaucratic records that seemed to confirm Millbrook Hollow's existence as a recognized municipal entity. But census workers continue to receive assignments involving communities throughout Appalachia that exist in similar administrative ambiguity, settlements that appear on some official databases while remaining invisible to others, populated by individuals whose backgrounds suggest they originally came from other locations but who seem to have found in these hidden valleys exactly the kind of life they were seeking when they first ventured into the mountains. Anna Brighton's final status reports, which arrive periodically at Census Bureau offices through channels that can't be traced through normal postal systems, describe ongoing demographic research in territories that exist parallel to conventional rural communities, where dedicated government workers spend their careers documenting populations that have discovered how to live in the spaces between official recognition and complete autonomy, maintaining the benefits of citizenship while avoiding the constraints that prevent most communities from achieving the kind of stability and satisfaction that make people want to stay rather than leave for opportunities elsewhere. Case 6. Case File. Hawthorne Ridge Sheriff Elena Vasquez had investigated hundreds of missing person cases during her 15-year career in law enforcement, but the disappearance of the Morrison family from their remote cabin on Hawthorne Ridge in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains challenged every principle of criminal investigation she'd learned at the State Police Academy and refined through decades of practical experience. The Morrisons, David, a geology professor at Virginia Tech, his wife Sarah, a freelance photographer specializing in Appalachian landscapes, and their twin 8-year-old daughters Emma and Sophie, had vanished sometime during the night of September 23, 2024, leaving behind a crime scene that violated basic laws of physics and created evidence patterns that no forensic expert could adequately explain using conventional investigative methodology. The initial missing persons report came from David's brother Michael, who had driven to the family's weekend cabin after they failed to return home to Blacksburg as scheduled and stopped responding to phone calls and text messages. Michael found the cabin exactly as the family should have left it for their planned Sunday departure. Beds neatly made, dishes washed and put away, personal belongings packed in suitcases that sat ready by the front door. The family's vehicle remained in its designated parking spot, keys hanging on their usual hook inside the cabin, with no evidence of mechanical problems or any reason the Morrisons couldn't have driven home as planned. Most puzzling was the absence of any signs of struggle, forced entry, or hasty departure that typically characterized kidnapping scenarios or emergency evacuations. Sheriff Vasquez's initial investigation followed standard missing person protocols, beginning with a comprehensive search of the surrounding wilderness area using tracking dogs, aerial reconnaissance, and teams of experienced search and rescue volunteers familiar with the region's challenging terrain. The search efforts revealed the first indication that the Morrison disappearance defied conventional explanation. Footprints belonging to all 4 family members led away from the cabin in a clear trail that could be followed for approximately 200 yards before terminating at the base of a vertical rock face that rose nearly 300 feet without any visible handholds, ledges, or feasible climbing routes that could explain how 4 people, including 2 young children, could have ascended such an obstacle without specialized mountaineering equipment. The footprint analysis conducted by state forensic experts revealed details that transformed the missing persons case into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human locomotion and spatial physics. The trail showed normal walking patterns and weight distribution for the first 100 yards, indicating that the family was moving at a leisurely pace without apparent distress or urgency. But as the prints approached the rock face, the stride patterns began to change in ways that suggested the Morrisons were gradually adapting to walking on surfaces that weren't horizontal. Footprints that showed increasing toe pressure and heel lift consistent with ascending steep inclines, despite the ground remaining completely level according to surveying equipment and topographical measurements. The final 20 yards of the trail presented evidence that forensic investigators would later describe as impossible under known physical laws governing human movement. The footprints maintained their clear definition and normal pressure patterns while showing orientation changes that indicated the family was walking up the vertical rock face as if it were a gradually sloping path. Each print was positioned at angles that would require the walkers to be perpendicular to gravity, yet the impressions showed none of the distortion or irregularity that would result from people struggling to maintain balance on an impossible surface. Most unnervingly, The final prints at the base of the cliff face showed the family stepping directly into solid stone, with clear toe impressions visible in granite that geological analysis confirmed was continuous bedrock with no fissures, caves, or structural anomalies that could explain their disappearance. Sheriff Vasquez ordered a comprehensive forensic analysis of the cabin and surrounding area, hoping that microscopic evidence would reveal clues that visual inspection had missed. The investigation uncovered trace materials that deepened the mystery rather than providing rational explanations. Samples collected from the areas where the footprints terminated contained mineral compositions that didn't match the local geological survey data, crystalline structures that resembled quartz formations but displayed optical properties that bent light in ways that created visual distortions around the collection sites. More disturbing were the electromagnetic readings detected by sensitive instruments, which showed fluctuating energy patterns concentrated along the exact path the family had taken, as if their passage had left behind some kind of dimensional residue that continued to affect the physical properties of the affected area. The breakthrough in understanding came when Vasquez discovered David Morrison's research notes in his cabin study, documents that revealed his professional interest in geological anomalies throughout the Appalachian Mountains and his growing conviction that certain locations exhibited properties that couldn't be explained through conventional earth sciences. Morrison had been documenting mineral formations, magnetic field variations, and underground water systems that seemed to follow patterns suggesting the presence of structures or forces that operated according to principles beyond mainstream geological knowledge. His most recent notes, dated just days before the disappearance, described Hawthorne Ridge as a location where conventional spatial geometry becomes negotiable under specific atmospheric and astronomical conditions. Morrison's documentation included detailed measurements of gravitational variations around the ridge that showed subtle but consistent deviations from normal readings, electromagnetic field fluctuations that followed patterns corresponding to lunar phases and seasonal changes, and acoustic properties that created sound transmission effects resembling those found in large underground chambers despite geological surveys indicating solid bedrock extending hundreds of feet below the surface. Most significantly, his notes referenced local Cherokee oral traditions that described Hawthorne Ridge as a location where the barriers between worlds become thin during certain times, allowing travel to territories that existed parallel to normal physical space but could only be accessed by individuals who understood the proper procedures for dimensional transition. The security camera system that David Morrison had installed to monitor wildlife activity around the cabin provided the final piece of evidence that transformed the missing persons case into something beyond the scope of conventional law enforcement investigation. The cameras had captured the family's departure from the cabin at approximately 2:30 a.m. on September 24th, showing all four Morrisons walking calmly toward the woods while carrying no luggage, supplies, or equipment that would suggest they were planning an extended journey. The footage showed them moving with purposeful direction, following the exact path where investigators would later find their footprints, but as they approached the rock face, the video began to exhibit distortions that technical analysis couldn't explain. The final minutes of footage showed the Morrison family walking directly toward the vertical cliff face, but instead of stopping or turning away, they appeared to continue their forward motion while gradually becoming transparent and insubstantial, as if they were transitioning into a different phase of physical existence that allowed them to pass through solid rock as easily as walking through air. The camera angle showed them maintaining their normal walking posture and speed while disappearing into the granite surface, leaving behind no indication of struggle, confusion, or supernatural coercion. They simply stepped from one type of reality into another, moving with the confidence of people who understood exactly where they were going and how to get there. Sheriff Vasquez's final report to state authorities recommended that the Morrison case be classified as resolved through voluntary relocation to an undetermined jurisdiction beyond local law enforcement authority, using carefully chosen language that conveyed the impossibility of the situation without explicitly acknowledging that the family had apparently traveled to a destination that existed outside normal spatial dimensions. The report noted that all evidence suggested the Morrisons had departed willingly and with advanced planning, following procedures that David Morrison had researched extensively and that allowed them to access territories that overlapped with but weren't constrained by conventional geography. The Hawthorne Ridge area was quietly restricted by Virginia state authorities, who cited ongoing geological research and potential safety hazards as justification for preventing public access to the location where the Morrison family had disappeared. But local law enforcement continues to receive reports of unusual phenomena in the region. hikers who describe hearing voices speaking in languages they don't recognize, photographers whose cameras capture images of landscapes that don't match the actual terrain, and families who seem to be exploring areas that exist parallel to the normal hiking trails, visible but unreachable by people who remain confined to conventional spatial limitations. Elena Vasquez maintains the Morrison case file in active status despite pressure from bureaucratic authorities to declare the family legally dead and close the investigation. She continues to study David Morrison's research notes and Cherokee oral traditions, developing theories about locations throughout Appalachia where dedicated families might discover that the territories they've been seeking actually exist in dimensions adjacent to normal reality, accessible to those who understand that some disappearances aren't tragedies but translations into forms of existence that offer exactly the kind of life that drove them to seek remote mountain locations in the first place, where professional knowledge and family bonds can be utilized in territories that operate according to natural laws, more flexible than those governing the world they left behind. Case 7. The Herbalist's Garden Doctor. Felix Chen had dedicated his career to documenting the extraordinary botanical diversity of Appalachian ecosystems, but the research grant that brought him to the remote mountains of eastern Tennessee in April 2024 promised discoveries that would challenge everything mainstream botany understood about plant evolution, adaptation, and the relationship between indigenous flora and the unique geological conditions found in North America's oldest mountain range. The Smithsonian Institution had tasked him with investigating reports of plant species that appeared to exhibit characteristics inconsistent with known evolutionary pathways. Flowers that bloomed according to lunar cycles rather than seasonal changes, trees that produced fruit containing alkaloid compounds similar to those found in South American rainforest species, and medicinal herbs that demonstrated therapeutic properties far beyond those documented in traditional Appalachian folk medicine. Chen established his research camp in a valley that local Cherokee guides referred to as the place where medicine grows wild, a location that had been avoided by commercial logging operations despite containing timber specimens that appeared valuable according to aerial surveys conducted by the Forest Service. The guides spoke of the valley with a mixture of reverence and unease, describing it as a location where the old knowledge still lives in the plants themselves, but they refused to accompany Chen into the research area, citing traditional prohibitions against harvesting botanical specimens without proper ceremonial preparation and community approval from elders who possessed the authority to negotiate with what they called the plant spirits. The first week of Chen's botanical survey revealed flora that defied conventional taxonomic classification, beginning with specimens that appeared to be familiar Appalachian species but exhibited morphological characteristics that suggested hybridization with plants native to completely different continents and climatic zones. He discovered what appeared to be wild ginseng roots that contained chemical compounds identical to those found in Asian varieties that had been cultivated for thousands of years in regions where no historical contact with North American species should have occurred. More puzzling were flowering plants that resembled common mountain laurel but produced blossoms that changed color and configuration throughout the day, following patterns that corresponded precisely to the movement of celestial bodies across the sky. Chen's research methodology involved comprehensive documentation of each species through digital photography, chemical analysis of plant tissues, and careful collection of specimens for laboratory examination at his university facilities in California. But as his work progressed, he began experiencing phenomena that challenged his scientific training and forced him to question whether he was studying ordinary botanical specimens or encountering something that operated according to principles beyond conventional plant biology. The specimens he collected seemed to maintain their fresh appearance and chemical potency for far longer than should have been possible given the preservation methods he was using, while his photographic documentation revealed details that weren't visible during actual field observation. Root systems that extended much deeper than his excavation had revealed, flowering patterns that showed mathematical precision suggesting intelligent design rather than random evolutionary development. Most disturbing was Chen's growing realization that the plants seemed to be responding to his presence and research activities in ways that indicated awareness and intentionality that went far beyond normal phototropic or chemical responses to environmental stimuli. Specimens that he marked for future collection would often disappear overnight, only to reappear in different locations with additional growth or flowering that suggested accelerated development under conditions that should have prevented such rapid changes. His research notes began documenting what he cautiously described as apparent communication between plant specimens, Observing that chemical changes in one species seemed to trigger corresponding reactions in botanically unrelated plants growing throughout the valley, creating networks of biochemical information exchange that resembled the mycorrhizal connections found in forest ecosystems, but operated with complexity and speed that exceeded anything documented in scientific literature. The breakthrough in Chen's understanding came when he discovered a grove of trees that appeared to be maintaining a living library of botanical knowledge, with each specimen containing chemical compounds that corresponded to medicinal plants from regions throughout the world where such species should not have been able to survive, given the Tennessee mountain climate and soil conditions. The tree's bark contained alkaloids identical to those found in Amazon rainforest species used by indigenous shamans for consciousness-altering ceremonies, while their leaves produced compounds that matched the therapeutic agents found in Tibetan high-altitude herbs used for treating altitude sickness and respiratory disorders. Most remarkably, the sap from these trees contained what appeared to be a complete pharmacological database, chemical signatures that corresponded to thousands of medicinal plants from every continent and climate zone on Earth. Chen's analysis of this botanical impossibility led him to hypothesize that he had discovered what he termed in his research notes as a convergence zone, where plant species from multiple geographical regions and historical periods coexist in the same ecological space, creating conditions that allowed for genetic and chemical exchange between flora that should have been isolated by continental drift, climatic barriers, and evolutionary timelines spanning millions of years. His chemical analysis revealed that the valley's soil contained mineral compositions that didn't match geological surveys of the region, trace elements that suggested influence from meteorite impacts, volcanic activity, and tectonic processes that hadn't occurred in eastern Tennessee, according to established geological records. As Chen's research progressed through late spring and early summer, he began experiencing direct physiological effects from prolonged exposure to the valley's unique botanical environment. His field notes documented enhanced sensory perception, improved physical stamina, and, most significantly, what he described as expanded botanical intuition, an ability to identify the medicinal properties and optimal harvesting conditions for plants simply by observing them, without requiring the chemical analysis and literature research that had previously been necessary for his scientific work. The plants seemed to be teaching him directly through biochemical interaction, transmitting knowledge through airborne compounds that his respiratory system processed in ways that bypassed conscious learning and directly integrated botanical information into his cellular memory. Chen's final research entries, dated July 15, 2024, documented discoveries that he admitted challenged the fundamental assumptions of his scientific career and suggested the existence of botanical intelligence that had been developing in isolation for thousands of years, creating an ecosystem where plants had evolved capabilities that resembled those attributed to advanced technological civilizations. The species I've been documenting aren't separate organisms competing for resources, he wrote in his characteristic precise scientific language that had gradually incorporated terminology and concepts that didn't exist in mainstream botanical literature. They're components of a unified biological intelligence that has been experimenting with chemical synthesis, genetic modification, and consciousness enhancement for millennia, developing techniques that surpass anything achieved by human pharmaceutical research. The notes described Chen's growing understanding that the valley served as a kind of botanical research facility where plant intelligence had been conducting experiments in biochemical engineering, consciousness expansion, and healing techniques that utilized principles beyond those recognized by conventional medicine. The plants had been selectively breeding themselves to develop therapeutic compounds that could treat diseases and conditions that human medicine was still struggling to understand, while simultaneously creating communication networks that allowed instantaneous sharing of chemical knowledge across species and geographical boundaries. Chen's final entry indicated that he had been invited to participate directly in these botanical experiments, contributing his scientific knowledge in exchange for access to healing and consciousness-expanding technologies that plants had been developing in isolation from human interference. When Chen failed to return from his research expedition, the search team that located his abandoned campsite found comprehensive documentation of his botanical discoveries, including chemical analysis results that confirmed his claims about the extraordinary properties of the valley's flora. But Chen himself was nowhere to be found, despite extensive searches of the surrounding wilderness area. His research equipment remained carefully organized around specimens that continued to thrive despite being separated from their native soil, while his laboratory samples maintained their potency and exhibited continued development that suggested ongoing biological processes that should have ceased upon collection. The Smithsonian Institution classified Chen's disappearance as an unfortunate wilderness accident, but quietly funded additional research expeditions to investigate his botanical claims and locate the valley he had described in such extraordinary detail. Subsequent researchers report encountering Cherokee guides who speak of Chen as having achieved what they call plant knowledge integration, a transformation that allows dedicated botanists to continue their research by becoming part of the biological intelligence networks they study, contributing human scientific methodology to botanical experiments that operate on timescales and complexity levels that exceed individual human lifespans. Chen's research notes continue to arrive at his university laboratory through channels that can't be traced, documenting ongoing discoveries in biochemical synthesis, consciousness enhancement, and healing techniques that utilize plant intelligence principles. The notes describe collaborative research between human and botanical intelligence, developing therapeutic compounds that address medical conditions that conventional medicine hasn't yet learned to treat, suggesting that some scientific researchers find their true calling by surrendering individual identity in favor of participation in biological intelligence networks that offer opportunities for discovery and healing that operate beyond the limitations of human-only scientific investigation. Case 8. Whitewater. Cassandra Wells had guided rafting expeditions down every major river system in the Appalachian Mountains for 12 years, earning a reputation among adventure tourism companies for her ability to navigate dangerous rapids while maintaining perfect safety records and keeping clients engaged with her encyclopedic knowledge of regional history, geology, and wildlife. But the private expedition she agreed to lead in June 2024 took her into territory that didn't appear on any of the topographical maps she'd spent years memorizing, a tributary system that local Cherokee River guides mentioned only in whispers, referring to it as the water that flows between worlds, a waterway that appeared and disappeared according to seasonal patterns and atmospheric conditions that followed no predictable schedule. The clients who hired Wells for this expedition were Dr. Amanda Foster, a hydrologist from the University of North Carolina studying anomalous water systems throughout Appalachia, her graduate assistant Marcus Rivera, and photographer Sarah Kim, who specialized in documenting remote wilderness areas for environmental conservation organizations. They had contacted Wells after learning about her reputation for accessing river systems that other guides considered too dangerous or technically challenging, offering payment that was triple her normal rate in exchange for her willingness to explore waterways that might not appear on official navigational charts and could require improvised route finding through terrain that had never been commercially rafted. The expedition began at what appeared to be a standard put-in location along the French Broad River system in western North Carolina, but within the first hour of downstream travel, Wells noticed that the water was carrying them into territory that contradicted her understanding of regional hydrology. The river seemed to be flowing through valleys that were deeper and narrower than topographical surveys indicated possible, with rock formations that showed geological layering patterns suggesting much greater age and different mineral compositions than the standard Appalachian bedrock that characterized the region. More unnervingly, the water itself exhibited properties that challenged Wells's 12 years of experience reading river conditions, current patterns that seemed to defy the principles of fluid dynamics, eddies that rotated in directions opposite to what the surrounding terrain should have produced, and rapids that generated sounds unlike any whitewater acoustics she'd encountered in hundreds of previous expeditions. Dr. Foster's scientific instruments began detecting anomalies that transformed what should have been a routine guided rafting trip into something resembling an expedition into uncharted territory. Her portable water analysis equipment revealed mineral compositions that didn't match any known watershed in the region, with trace elements that suggested the river was flowing through underground geological formations containing rare earth metals and radioactive isotopes at concentrations that would have made the area a significant mining target if such deposits actually existed, according to official geological surveys. More disturbing were the temperature readings, which showed that different sections of the river maintained dramatically different thermal characteristics despite flowing as a continuous water system, some areas warm enough to support tropical aquatic life, while others remained cold enough to prevent most biological activity. The first indication that they were rafting through something beyond normal river systems came when Marcus Rivera noticed that his GPS equipment was providing coordinates that placed their location simultaneously in North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia, while his compass readings fluctuated wildly, sometimes pointing toward magnetic north, sometimes toward geographical features that weren't visible from their position on the water. Wells attempted to navigate using traditional river reading techniques, but discovered that the water patterns she was observing seemed to change configuration while she was looking at them. Rapids that appeared manageable from upstream revealing themselves to be much more technical and dangerous when approached directly, while sections that looked intimidating from a distance turned out to offer surprisingly safe passage through channels that hadn't been visible during initial scouting. The river carried them deeper into mountain territory that became increasingly unfamiliar despite Wells's extensive knowledge of Appalachian geography, through valleys that seemed to exist in a different geological epoch entirely, with vegetation patterns that incorporated plant species from multiple climate zones growing in impossible proximity to each other. Sarah Kim's photography revealed details that weren't visible during direct observation. Ancient petroglyphs carved into rock faces along the riverbanks, depicting symbols that resembled river navigation charts but used design elements that didn't correspond to any known Native American artistic traditions, and, most unnervingly, images of rafting expeditions that appeared to show modern people using contemporary equipment traveling through the same river system, despite the photographs bearing no resemblance to any expedition Wells had ever participated in or heard described by other regional guides. The transformation from routine guided trip to something approaching supernatural experience occurred when the river began displaying characteristics that violated basic principles of hydrology and physics. The water started flowing uphill through sections where gravitational pull should have made such movement impossible, carrying their raft through rapids that seemed to exist in multiple elevations simultaneously, creating the sensation of descending through whitewater while climbing toward higher altitudes according to atmospheric pressure readings and visual landmarks. Wells found herself navigating using instincts and techniques she'd never learned but somehow understood, reading water patterns that followed principles beyond conventional river dynamics and required response strategies that seemed to emerge from knowledge sources deeper than her conscious experience and training. Dr. Foster's scientific documentation revealed that they were traveling through a river system that operated according to hydrological principles that challenged mainstream understanding of how water systems function within normal geological parameters. Her instruments detected underground connections between their river and watershed systems throughout multiple states, suggesting that the water was flowing through subterranean channels that extended for hundreds of miles through geological formations that shouldn't have been able to support such extensive cave networks. Most significantly, her analysis indicated that the river system was somehow connected to water sources from different historical periods, mixing ancient groundwater with contemporary precipitation in proportions that created chemical signatures spanning thousands of years of regional environmental history. The expedition's final entry in Wells's professional logbook, recorded during what she estimated to be their 7th day on a river system that should have been navigable in 2 days maximum, documented the discovery of a community situated along the riverbank in a location that couldn't be reached through any known overland route. The settlement consisted of people who appeared to be river guides, researchers, and adventure travelers from multiple historical periods, all maintaining equipment and clothing appropriate to their original time periods while living together in a community that had adapted to conditions that existed only along waterways that flowed between normal geographical boundaries and alternative versions of Appalachian landscape that offered unlimited opportunities for exploration and discovery. "We've found the place that river guides spend their careers searching for without knowing it exists," Wells wrote in her final entry, using language that had gradually evolved throughout the expedition to incorporate terminology and concepts that weren't part of standard rafting vocabulary. "This isn't a river system that goes somewhere else. It's a waterway that exists in the spaces between different versions of the same mountains, connecting all the places we've ever wanted to explore but could never reach through conventional navigation. The water flows between worlds, and following it properly requires guides who understand that some rivers can only be run by people willing to surrender fixed destinations in favor of perpetual discovery." When Wells's expedition failed to reach their designated takeout location, search and rescue teams conducted extensive operations throughout the French Broad River system, but found no trace of the 4 missing rafters or their equipment. Local Cherokee River guides reported that during certain atmospheric conditions, they sometimes observed rafting expeditions traveling through sections of river that don't appear on any topographical survey, following waterways that seem to exist parallel to normal geography while remaining visible but inaccessible to people confined to conventional spatial limitations. Wells's outfitter business continues to receive equipment orders placed through channels that can't be traced, requesting specialized gear for expeditions through river systems that operate according to hydrological principles beyond those recognized by mainstream geography, suggesting that dedicated river professionals sometimes discover that their true calling lies in guiding expeditions through territories where the journey itself becomes more important than any specific destination, and where the skills required for safe passage can only be learned by surrendering to currents that flow between worlds rather than simply between geographical locations. Case 9. The Hollow Echo. Dominic Reyes had built his reputation as a sound engineer by capturing audio recordings in environments where conventional equipment failed, documenting the acoustic properties of underground cave systems, recording whale songs in deep ocean trenches, and preserving the sounds of disappearing ecosystems in remote locations where human activity had never penetrated. The contract that brought him to the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia in August 2024 promised his most challenging assignment yet, mapping the acoustic landscape of a region where local residents reported hearing sounds that didn't correspond to any identifiable natural or human-made sources. Voices speaking in languages that linguistics experts couldn't classify, musical patterns that seemed to emerge from the mountains themselves, and, most unnervingly, conversations that appeared to be taking place in real time between people who had been missing for decades. The National Science Foundation had funded Reyes's research after receiving multiple reports from hikers, residents, and Park Service personnel describing acoustic phenomena that seemed to violate basic principles of sound transmission and propagation. Witnesses consistently reported hearing human voices speaking with perfect clarity, despite being in locations where no other people were present, conversations that demonstrated knowledge of current events, local geography, and personal information about the listeners that suggested the voices belonged to individuals with detailed awareness of contemporary life in surrounding communities. Most disturbing were accounts from family members of missing persons who claimed to recognize the voices of relatives who had disappeared years earlier, speaking as if they were continuing conversations that had been interrupted only moments before. Reyes established his recording station in a valley that locals called the Listening Place, a natural amphitheater formed by surrounding ridges that created acoustic conditions, allowing sounds to carry for unusual distances while maintaining clarity and directional precision that enabled listeners to pinpoint exact locations of sound sources even when no visual confirmation was possible. His professional equipment included directional microphones sensitive enough to detect whispered conversations at distances exceeding a mile, digital recording systems capable of analyzing frequency patterns and acoustic signatures with laboratory precision, and sound mapping technology that could create three-dimensional models of how audio waves moved through complex terrain and atmospheric conditions. The first week of recording sessions captured standard environmental audio, wind patterns through different types of vegetation, water movement over various geological formations, and the typical wildlife sounds that characterized healthy Appalachian ecosystems. But as Reyes fine-tuned his equipment sensitivity and expanded his recording range, he began detecting audio phenomena that challenged everything he understood about acoustic physics and sound transmission. His instruments picked up human voices engaged in conversations that seemed to be taking place in locations where his visual reconnaissance had confirmed no people were present, discussions that referenced current news events, weather conditions, and local activities with accuracy that suggested the speakers possessed real-time awareness of contemporary life in the surrounding region. The breakthrough came when Reyes realized that his recording equipment was capturing audio from what appeared to be multiple temporal periods simultaneously, with conversations from different decades overlapping in the same acoustic space while maintaining perfect clarity and distinctness. His analysis revealed voices discussing events from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and contemporary periods, all speaking as if they were experiencing those events in present tense while demonstrating awareness of developments that occurred in later time periods. Most unsettling were conversations that seemed to be taking place between people from different historical periods, with speakers from the 1980s discussing current technology and social media trends with individuals who spoke using contemporary slang and cultural references. Reyes's technical analysis revealed that the acoustic signatures matched voice patterns of people who had been reported missing from the region over the past 50 years, individuals whose disappearances had never been solved and who were presumed dead after extensive search efforts failed to locate them. His digital voice analysis software confirmed matches with audio samples from missing person case files, recordings of phone messages, interview footage, and home videos that family members had provided to authorities during initial investigations. The voices were speaking with the same inflection patterns, vocabulary choices, and speech characteristics that had been documented years earlier, but discussing experiences that suggested they had continued living and developing in environments that existed parallel to normal temporal progression. The most disturbing discovery came when Reyes detected his own voice among the recorded conversations, speaking about events and experiences that he had no memory of participating in, discussing technical details about sound engineering projects he had never undertaken, and engaging in conversations with people he was certain he had never met. The recorded version of his voice demonstrated knowledge about acoustic phenomena in the region that exceeded his actual research findings, describing sound transmission techniques and recording methods that he had never learned, but that seemed to represent advanced developments of his professional expertise applied to conditions that didn't exist in normal acoustic environments. As Reyes's documentation progressed through late August and early September, he found that his recording sessions were becoming interactive experiences rather than passive documentation of existing sounds. The voices began responding directly to his presence and research activities, offering technical advice about optimal microphone placement, suggesting recording techniques that produced dramatically improved audio quality, and most unnervingly, providing detailed information about missing persons cases throughout the region while speaking with the voices of the disappeared individuals themselves. The conversation suggested that people who had vanished from normal reality continued to exist in acoustic dimensions that overlapped with physical space but operated according to different temporal and spatial parameters. Reyes's final recording session, conducted during the autumn equinox on September 22nd, captured audio that he described in his research notes as a comprehensive oral history project being conducted by people who have discovered that disappearance from normal reality doesn't mean death, but rather translation into conditions that allow unlimited time for conversation, reflection, and the sharing of experiences across multiple time periods. The voices explained that certain locations throughout the Appalachian Mountains served as acoustic portals, where sound could travel between different temporal layers of the same geographical space, allowing communication between people who existed in parallel versions of the region that had developed according to different historical outcomes and natural laws. When the National Science Foundation attempted to contact Reyes for his final research report, they discovered that all communication with his field station had ceased, despite his equipment continuing to transmit data that suggested ongoing recording activities. The audio files that arrived at the Foundation's servers contained Reyes's voice describing research discoveries that expanded far beyond his original assignment, documenting acoustic phenomena that existed throughout a network of sound transmission portals, connecting missing persons who had found ways to continue their lives in dimensions that existed parallel to normal reality, while remaining connected to their original communities through advanced acoustic technologies that operated according to principles beyond conventional sound engineering. Local residents continued to report hearing voices in the valley that Reyes had chosen for his research location, including conversations that feature his distinctive speaking patterns and professional terminology discussing ongoing sound mapping projects in territories that exist beyond normal acoustic parameters. His recording equipment remains active in the abandoned field station, continuing to document conversations between individuals who have discovered that dedication to understanding acoustic phenomena sometimes leads to opportunities for participation in sound transmission. Networks that operate across multiple dimensions of time and space, where professional audio engineers can spend unlimited time perfecting recording techniques that capture the voices of communities existing in the spaces between what was, what is, and what could be, creating permanent audio archives of human experience that transcend the limitations of individual lifespans and conventional temporal progression. Case 10. Digital Footprints. Morgan Webb had spent 8 years tracking missing persons through digital forensics, following electronic trails that conventional investigators missed, credit card transactions that occurred after disappearances, social media activity that continued despite physical absence, and GPS data that placed missing individuals in locations where extensive searches had found no trace of human presence. The case that consumed Webb's attention throughout the fall of 2024 began as a routine analysis of digital evidence related to 7 missing persons from across Appalachian states, but evolved into something that challenged every assumption about the relationship between digital identity and physical existence, revealing patterns suggesting that modern technology was documenting activities and communications from people who existed in dimensions parallel to normal reality. The initial assignment came from a consortium of law enforcement agencies seeking to identify connections between disappearances that had occurred over an 18-month period throughout Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Each case involved individuals who had vanished while engaged in outdoor activities, hiking, camping, research expeditions, or professional work in remote mountain locations, leaving behind digital footprints that seemed to continue expanding after their physical disappearances. Credit cards showed ongoing transactions. Social media accounts remained active with posts that demonstrated current awareness of friends' activities and regional events, and cell phone data revealed location pings from areas that search teams had thoroughly investigated without finding any evidence of human habitation. Webb's analysis revealed digital activity patterns that defied rational explanation, beginning with social media posts that appeared on the accounts of missing persons at times when their physical bodies were confirmed to be absent from any location with internet connectivity. The posts demonstrated intimate knowledge of current events, personal relationships, and local developments that would require real-time access to information sources, while including photographic content that showed familiar faces in unfamiliar environments, landscapes that resembled Appalachian terrain but incorporated geographical features that didn't appear on any topographical survey. Most disturbing were posts that referenced interactions with family members and friends, describing conversations and shared experiences that the mentioned individuals had no memory of participating in. The breakthrough came when Webb discovered that the missing person's digital devices were generating data streams that originated from network connections that couldn't be traced through conventional internet infrastructure, accessing online services through pathways that bypassed normal telecommunications systems while maintaining perfect functionality, and security protocols. The devices appeared to be connecting to internet services through what Webb's technical analysis described as alternative network architectures that operate parallel to standard infrastructure while maintaining full compatibility with conventional platforms and applications. Credit card transactions were being processed through financial networks that existed alongside but independent from normal banking systems, while social media activity was being transmitted through communication channels that couldn't be detected by standard network monitoring equipment. Webb's investigation expanded to include analysis of the digital communications themselves, revealing content that suggested the missing persons had found ways to continue their lives in environments that existed parallel to normal physical space while maintaining digital connections that allowed ongoing interaction with friends, family, and professional colleagues who remained in conventional reality. The messages described experiences that combined familiar personal relationships and career activities with elements that seemed to exist in enhanced versions of the locations where the individuals had originally disappeared. They wrote about continuing their work, research projects, artistic endeavors, professional responsibilities, but in environments that offered unlimited resources, collaborative opportunities with colleagues from different time periods, and access to technologies that exceeded anything available through normal channels. Most unnervingly, Webb began receiving direct communications from the missing persons' accounts, messages that acknowledged her investigation and offered explanations for the digital phenomena she was documenting. The communications described a process of voluntary transition into what they termed enhanced existence parameters, where consciousness could maintain digital connectivity while experiencing physical reality through expanded spatial and temporal dimensions. The messages explained that certain locations throughout the Appalachian Mountains served as transition zones where dedicated individuals could choose to continue their lives in conditions that offered unlimited opportunities for personal and professional development while maintaining connections to the communities and relationships they valued. Webb's own digital footprint began exhibiting anomalies as her investigation progressed, with her devices generating data streams and network connections that she hadn't initiated, but that seemed to be expanding her research capabilities beyond anything possible through conventional technology. Her computer systems gained access to databases and information sources that she couldn't identify, providing detailed documentation about missing persons cases throughout Appalachian history, including individuals who had disappeared decades before digital technology existed, but whose cases showed similar patterns of continued activity through whatever communication methods were available during their historical periods. Her email accounts began receiving messages from addresses that couldn't be traced, but that contained research data, analysis techniques, and investigative insights that accelerated her work while introducing concepts and methodologies that weren't taught in any digital forensics program. The transformation of Webb's investigation from passive analysis to active participation occurred when she realized that her research was being guided by the missing persons themselves, who were using advanced digital technologies to collaborate with her investigation, while demonstrating that disappearance from normal reality didn't require disconnection from digital life, but rather offered access to enhanced technological capabilities that operated according to principles beyond conventional computer science. Her final case reports, submitted through channels that her colleagues couldn't access despite being transmitted from her official accounts, described the discovery of parallel digital infrastructures that existed alongside normal Internet systems but offered unlimited computational resources, instantaneous global communication, and access to information databases that included knowledge from multiple temporal periods and dimensional configurations. When Webb's law enforcement colleagues attempted to contact her for clarification about her increasingly sophisticated reports and the remarkable digital evidence she was presenting, they discovered that all direct communication with her had become impossible through normal channels, despite her continued digital presence through social media accounts, email responses, and professional platforms that suggested ongoing activity and engagement with her forensic work. Her digital footprint continued expanding, documenting investigative discoveries and technical innovations that exceeded anything possible through conventional technology, while her social media accounts maintained active communication with friends and family members who reported that her posts demonstrated detailed awareness of their daily activities despite her physical absence from any location where such knowledge could have been acquired through normal observation. Webb's digital forensics equipment continues generating investigative reports that arrive at law enforcement agencies throughout Appalachia, documenting missing persons cases and providing digital evidence analysis that utilizes techniques and technologies beyond anything available through conventional forensic science. The reports describe collaborative research between investigators who have discovered that dedication to understanding digital mysteries sometimes leads to opportunities for participation in information networks that operate beyond the limitations of normal technological infrastructure, where digital forensic specialists can access unlimited computational resources and investigative databases while maintaining professional relationships and career development opportunities that continue indefinitely in environments designed specifically for people who understand that the most important investigative work often takes place in the spaces between conventional reality and the enhanced possibilities that become available to those willing to follow digital trails that lead beyond the boundaries of normal existence into territories where technology and consciousness combine to create investigative capabilities that exceed anything limited by conventional physical parameters or temporal constraints. Case 11. The Quilting Circle. The morning of October 13, 2024, marked the end of a tradition that had endured in the mountain community of Whitlow Creek, West Virginia for over 2 centuries, when 7 elderly women who comprised the town's legendary quilting circle vanished simultaneously from their weekly meeting at the Whitlow Creek Community Center, leaving behind their final collaborative masterpiece, a quilt that depicted a topographical map of impossible precision, showing geographical features that existed in no official survey while incorporating intricate needlework patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation and the quality of available light. The quilters, Martha Hensley, 73, Dolores Whitman, 81, Grace Morrison, 69, Ruth Caldwell, 78, Evelyn Santos, 75, Margaret Rivera, 82, and their unofficial leader, 85-year-old Nadine Thorne, had gathered every Thursday morning for decades, creating textile works that local residents treasured not only for their technical excellence, but for their uncanny ability to depict future events, weather patterns, and personal milestones with accuracy that transformed quilting from domestic craft into something approaching prophecy. The discovery of their disappearance came when Nadine's great-niece Isabel arrived at the community center to deliver lunch for the quilters as she had done every Thursday for the past 3 years. She found the meeting room exactly as the women should have left it, chairs arranged in their traditional circle, quilting frames positioned to accommodate the intricate handwork that had made Whitlow Creek quilts sought after by collectors throughout Appalachia, and sewing supplies organized with the meticulous care that characterized the group's approach to their craft. But the women themselves were nowhere to be found, despite the building being locked from the inside and showing no signs of forced entry or emergency evacuation that might explain their simultaneous absence. The quilt they had been working on dominated the center of the room, a massive textile construction that measured 12 feet by 12 feet and depicted what appeared to be an aerial view of the Appalachian Mountains rendered with geographical accuracy that exceeded anything available through conventional surveying methods. The needlework showed elevations, watershed boundaries, forest coverage, and geological formations with precision that would have required access to satellite imagery and professional cartographic resources, yet had been created entirely through traditional hand-quilting techniques using fabrics and threads that the women had gathered from their personal collections over decades of accumulating textile materials from estate sales, fabric shops, and inherited family supplies. But closer examination revealed that the geographical features depicted in the quilt didn't correspond to any known topographical reality. The map showed mountain ranges that extended beyond the actual boundaries of Appalachian territory, valleys that carved through terrain where geological surveys indicated continuous ridgelines, and, most unnervingly, communities marked with tiny embroidered houses scattered throughout areas that were officially designated as uninhabited wilderness. Each community was identified through careful needlework that included names like Millbrook Hollow, The Fold, Breathing Cave Settlement, The Listening Place, and Hawthorne Ridge Community, locations that appeared nowhere in official records but that seemed familiar to local residents who couldn't quite remember where they might have heard such place names. The investigation into the quilter's disappearance was led by Sheriff Elena Vasquez, whose previous experience with the Morrison family case had prepared her to recognize patterns that suggested disappearances beyond conventional criminal categories. Her examination of the community center revealed that the quilting circle had been working according to a systematic plan that extended far beyond their current project, with evidence suggesting they had been documenting locations throughout Appalachian territory for years through textile works that combined traditional folk art techniques with cartographic precision that challenged professional surveying standards. Hidden compartments in their quilting storage contained hundreds of smaller textile pieces, detailed fabric maps, embroidered diagrams, and needlework samples that seemed to serve as a comprehensive archive of geographical information about places that existed parallel to official territorial boundaries. The most significant discovery came when Sheriff Vasquez realized that the final quilt wasn't merely depicting geographical features, but serving as a functional navigation tool that provided detailed instructions for reaching the communities shown in its needlework patterns. The textile included compass directions, elevation changes, landmark identifications, and pathway markers that were integrated into decorative elements that appeared to be purely artistic, but actually contained precise technical information that could guide travelers to locations that remained invisible to people who didn't understand the symbolic language embedded in traditional quilting patterns. The women had been creating what amounted to a master map of hidden Appalachian territories, documenting communities that existed in the spaces between official geographical recognition and complete isolation. The breakthrough in understanding came when Isabel discovered her great-aunt Nadine's personal quilting journal, hidden inside a hope chest that required a combination lock set to numbers that corresponded to the founding date of the Whitlow Creek Quilting Circle in 1847. Written in precise handwriting that had remained steady despite Nadine's advanced age, the journal documented decades of quilting projects that had served purposes beyond decorative or commemorative functions. "Our needlework preserves the true geography of these mountains," Nadine had written in her final entry, dated October 12th, the evening before the disappearance. Each quilt captures locations where people have found ways to continue their lives beyond the limitations of conventional existence, communities that thrive in territories that exist parallel to the world that most people recognize as reality. The journal revealed that the quilting circle had been maintaining communication with residents of the hidden communities through textile works that served as both artistic expression and practical communication tools, creating needlework that conveyed information about weather patterns, seasonal changes, resource availability, and social developments that affected people living in territories that remained invisible to standard geographical surveys. The women had been serving as official chroniclers and communication coordinators for a network of settlements that existed throughout Appalachian territory, using traditional domestic skills to maintain connections between communities that operated according to different natural laws while sharing common cultural heritage and collaborative relationships. Most remarkably, the journal indicated that the quilting circle's disappearance was not a tragedy, but a graduation, the culmination of decades of service that had earned them invitations to join the communities they had been documenting and supporting through their textile work. "We have completed our responsibilities as surface chroniclers," Nadine had written. "The time has come for us to contribute our skills directly to the communities that need experienced textile workers who understand how to create functional art that serves practical purposes in environments where traditional domestic skills become advanced technologies that support sustainable living arrangements." When authorities attempted to investigate the locations indicated on the quilter's final map, they discovered that the geographical coordinates led to areas that appeared different depending on environmental conditions, atmospheric pressure changes, and what local Cherokee guides described as the mountain's willingness to be seen. During certain weather patterns and astronomical alignments, search teams reported glimpsing communities nestled in valleys that should have been impassable wilderness, settlements that incorporated architectural elements from multiple historical periods while showing evidence of advanced sustainable living technologies that exceeded anything available through conventional environmental engineering. The Whitlow Creek Community Center maintains the Quilting Circle's final masterpiece as a permanent display, though visitors report that the geographical features depicted in the needlework seem to evolve over time, showing seasonal changes, new settlements, and pathway modifications that suggest the textile continues to serve as an active communication tool between the disappeared quilters and communities that exist throughout hidden Appalachian territories. Local women have attempted to restart the traditional quilting circle, but their needlework lacks the geographical precision and prophetic accuracy that characterize their predecessors' creations, producing beautiful but conventional textile works that serve purely decorative functions rather than the cartographic and communicative purposes that had made the original group's quilts essential infrastructure for maintaining connections between surface reality and the enhanced communities that exist in the spaces between official recognition and complete autonomy. The 7 missing quilters are remembered not as victims of mysterious disappearance, but as master craftswomen who achieved the highest level of their traditional art by discovering that dedication to preserving cultural knowledge through domestic skills sometimes leads to opportunities for direct participation in communities where such skills become essential technologies for maintaining sustainable relationships between human creativity and the natural world, where experienced textile workers continue their craft while contributing to societies that have learned to live according to principles that integrate traditional wisdom with environmental harmony in territories that remain forever available to those who understand that some of life's most important work takes place in locations that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional maps, but can be reached by following the precise directions embedded in needlework created by people who spent their lives documenting the true geography of possibility. Case 12. The Final Survey. The Appalachian Geological Research Expedition of October 2024 represented the most comprehensive scientific investigation ever undertaken in the region's most remote territories. A collaborative effort between 6 major universities involving 23 researchers specializing in disciplines ranging from geology and archaeology to atmospheric physics and consciousness studies. Led by Dr. Rebecca Morrison, the expedition was tasked with investigating what satellite imagery had identified as a massive underground cavity system extending beneath portions of Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina. A geological formation so vast that its existence challenged fundamental assumptions about Appalachian bedrock composition, while potentially explaining the mysterious disappearances, atmospheric anomalies, and electromagnetic irregularities that had been documented throughout the region for decades. The expedition team included specialists whose previous work had prepared them for investigating phenomena that existed at the intersection of conventional science and unexplained mystery. Dr. Amanda Foster, whose hydrological research had documented impossible water systems throughout the mountains. Dr. Felix Chen's graduate student Marcus Rivera, who had been studying botanical anomalies before his mentor's disappearance. Sound engineer Sarah Kim, who specialized in acoustic mapping of underground structures, and digital forensics expert Elena Vasquez, who had transitioned from law enforcement to academic research after her experiences with missing persons cases that defied conventional investigation. The team was equipped with ground-penetrating radar, seismic analysis equipment, atmospheric monitoring instruments, and communication systems designed to maintain contact with surface operations while exploring underground territories that might extend for hundreds of miles through geological formations that standard surveys indicated should be solid bedrock. Initial surface reconnaissance revealed entrance points that had been concealed through what appeared to be deliberate landscape modification, using techniques that combined advanced engineering with intimate knowledge of natural geological processes. The primary access site was located in a valley that local Cherokee oral traditions described as the place where the mountain opens its heart to those who understand proper approach protocols, hidden behind rock formations that had been precisely positioned to create optical illusions that made the entrance appear to be solid cliff face when viewed from most angles. Only when approached from specific directions during particular atmospheric conditions did the opening become visible, a natural cathedral-sized chamber that extended deep into the mountain's interior, with acoustics that amplified whispered conversations while maintaining perfect sound clarity across distances that exceeded the capabilities of the team's professional audio equipment. Dr. Morrison's geological analysis revealed that the underground system wasn't a natural cave formation, but rather an engineered environment that had been constructed using techniques that exceeded contemporary understanding of subterranean architecture and construction methods. The passages followed mathematical principles that created optimal air circulation, natural lighting through strategically positioned openings that focused surface illumination with mirror-like precision, and acoustic properties that enabled communication across vast distances through sound transmission methods that resembled advanced technological systems more than natural cave acoustics. Most remarkably, the underground chambers maintained consistent temperatures and humidity levels that created ideal living conditions while providing natural water sources, food production areas, and spaces designed for various professional and artistic activities. As the expedition progressed deeper into the underground system, team members began encountering evidence of habitation that spanned multiple historical periods, living spaces that incorporated architectural elements from different centuries while showing continuous occupation and ongoing development according to sustainable environmental principles that exceeded anything achieved by surface communities. The inhabitants they encountered were individuals whose faces and voices were familiar from missing persons files, people who had vanished from surface reality but continued their chosen work in environments that offered unlimited resources and collaborative opportunities with colleagues from different time periods and academic disciplines who shared common interests in advancing human knowledge and creative expression beyond the limitations imposed by conventional social and economic structures. The expedition's most significant discovery came when they realized that the underground system wasn't merely a refuge or alternative community, but rather a comprehensive research and development facility where human consciousness was being studied and enhanced through collaborative projects between surface scientists and intelligences that had been developing advanced technologies for centuries. The facilities included laboratories equipped with instruments that operated according to principles beyond conventional physics, libraries containing knowledge accumulated from multiple civilizations and historical periods, and communication systems that maintained connections with similar facilities throughout global underground networks that existed parallel to surface reality while remaining invisible to people who hadn't been specifically invited to participate in their research programs. Dr. Morrison's final expedition report, transmitted through channels that surface authorities couldn't trace but that maintained perfect clarity and comprehensive detail, described the team's collective decision to accept invitations to join the underground research community on a permanent basis. We have discovered that the most important scientific work is being conducted by people who have found ways to transcend the limitations of individual lifespans, institutional politics, and resource constraints that prevent surface communities from achieving their full potential. Morrison wrote in language that had evolved throughout the expedition to incorporate concepts and terminology that weren't taught in conventional academic programs. The underground facilities offer unlimited research opportunities, collaboration with colleagues whose expertise spans centuries of accumulated knowledge, and access to technologies that make possible investigations into consciousness, dimensional physics, and environmental engineering that exceed anything achievable through surface institutions. The report described ongoing research projects that addressed fundamental questions about human development, environmental sustainability, and the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. Investigations that required dedicated researchers willing to commit to long-term studies that might extend beyond individual lifespans, but offered opportunities to contribute to knowledge that could benefit human civilization for generations. The expedition team had been invited to continue their work in environments specifically designed for people whose dedication to scientific discovery exceeded their attachment to conventional career structures and social expectations, facilities where research could proceed according to optimal conditions rather than bureaucratic constraints and funding limitations. When surface authorities attempted to establish communication with the expedition team or locate the entrance points they had described, they discovered that the underground access sites had become undetectable through conventional methods, appearing as solid rock formations that showed no evidence of human modification or recent activity. Satellite imagery continued to indicate the presence of massive underground cavities, but ground-based investigations failed to locate any physical openings that could explain how 23 researchers and their equipment could have accessed subterranean territories that geological analysis indicated should be physically inaccessible. The participating universities continue to receive research reports that arrive through channels that can't be traced but that contain scientific discoveries and technological innovations that exceed anything achievable through surface research programs. Advances in consciousness studies, environmental engineering, dimensional physics, and collaborative methodologies that demonstrate the continued professional development of faculty members who have found ways to pursue their research interests in environments designed specifically for people whose dedication to advancing human knowledge takes precedence over conventional career expectations and social obligations. The reports describe collaborative projects between surface researchers and underground intelligences who have been developing technologies that could address fundamental challenges facing human civilization. Research that requires participants willing to contribute their expertise to investigations that operate beyond the limitations of normal institutional structures while maintaining the highest standards of scientific integrity and intellectual rigor. The final survey represents the culmination of all previous disappearances throughout Appalachian territory. The revelation that dedicated professionals from multiple disciplines have been gradually discovering that their true calling lies in participating in research and development programs that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional reality, where their skills and knowledge can contribute to projects that address the most important questions about human potential and environmental sustainability. Studies that require commitment to collaborative investigations that transcend individual limitations and offer opportunities for contributions that continue indefinitely in facilities designed by intelligences who understand that the most significant scientific work often takes place in territories that exist beyond normal geographical boundaries and social constraints, where researchers can focus entirely on advancing human knowledge and creative expression according to principles that prioritize discovery over profit, collaboration over competition, and long-term benefit over immediate gratification.